looking at the Gospel of Mark in our sermons. Well, occasionally we look at Mark. I guess we haven't actually looked at it a month out. Because the week before I went on holidays, we did have Ann Stevens here, so it's been a while since we've actually looked at the Gospel. We come to a critical story. A story we may pass over because it's one you learn in Sunday school. And maybe you don't look at it again, but it's actually one of the most critical moments in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus has spent an exhausting day, first of all, battling with the Pharisees and even his family. Then he goes down to the lakefront, and him and his disciples have a good time of teaching. And for whatever reason, we're not told, Jesus sees a little convoy of boats going out, and he wants to join them. And in Mark chapter 4, we find the story of the disciples getting on the boat with Jesus, and a little cushion goes at the back, and Jesus lies down at the back of the ship, and he takes a sleep, and all the experienced fishermen and all that, they take the lead in trying to get the ship from one side to the other. But things don't go well. A storm comes up. The little ship goes up and down, and water starts to come over the bow of the ship, and this little boat starts to take on water, presumably a lot of water. Things start to get really scary really quickly. The wind is whipping the ship around, and the experienced fishermen on the Lake of Galilee are getting worried. Now, I've said before, the Lake of Galilee is not a big lake. We call it the Sea of Galilee, usually. Because somehow, I guess in Israel, it comes across as a big place. Put it in context, it's about 1/3 the size of Cold Lake. If that puts it in any sort of context. But a storm could come up there. And a storm could threaten. And this little boat is tossed up and down, and these experienced fishermen are really worried. To the point, they look at Jesus, who somehow is asleep on his little pillow at the back, and they get upset. I mean, how do you sleep? I mean, he's being tossed up and down. There's water coming over the side. As the ship goes down into the wave, the water comes up onto the boat, and as the ship then goes up the next wave, all the water's going to go in the back of the boat, right? It's going to get swept over Jesus. Assumedly, it doesn't say this, but assumedly it's raining as well. I mean, it's hard to sleep outside when it's raining. How is he still asleep? And the disciples go and they start yelling at him. Don't you care? We're all going to die here. How can you be asleep on the edge of death? And Jesus just looks up and says, peace, be still. Looks at the disciples, you have little faith. You have little faith. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm not sure my first reaction when I don't like the weather is to automatically think I can change it. It's probably good I can't. This is a critical moment in the Gospel of Mark. In fact, it is actually a very critical moment in the entire Scriptures. You may not have even picked up on it. But this is a time in which Jesus is really proclaimed for who he's going to be, and it is a fulfillment of many portions of the Old Testament. There was a gentleman who was boarding a ship. He was nervous. He was from probably Alberta or some other landlocked place. And he went to a crew member and he said, do ships like this sink very often? And the crew member said no. Usually they only sink once. Why is this a critical story? Why is this a fulfillment of prophecies? Where we're going to go today, I'm going to tell you, I'm hoping it's going to open your eyes as you read parts of the Old Testament in particular as to why things are stated the way they are, and maybe gives you some insight into how you pick up your Bible. And we're going to get a little technical. We're going to jump around through a lot of different scriptures, so stay with me. I know it's going to be a little tough, but stay with me, because I think this is an important way to understand how we read the entire Bible. We're going to start by looking at the sea. Why was Jesus not afraid? Some people think it's because he was the novice in the boat, or maybe he was so exhausted he slept. I actually think it was a deliberate statement about the things that the disciples were concerned about. We read a little bit earlier from Psalm 89 about God's power over the sea. And I think understanding God's power over the sea is a key to understanding the entire Bible. Let me ask you a question. I'm going to ask, this will be an interactive part of the sermon. You can call back to me. You can answer. You can talk. I don't have to get to talk while I'm talking. Who can name the famous sailors who were Jewish of the Bible? Anybody name any famous characters from the Bible who went out in the ocean?
There were none.
Well, there were a couple. I can think of a couple of stories. How about Noah? Remember him? I know he wasn't technically a Hebrew, but how did that work out? Well, everybody drowned, except Noah. Anybody think of anybody else? Oh, we all have to go back to Sunday school.
Jonah.
Jonah, thank you. How did Jonah work out? He gets swallowed by a whale. He was a hitchhiker. There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, that's about all I can think of from the Old Testament. I can think of one from the New Testament, though, other than on the Sea of Galilee, but somebody actually went out in the ocean. What do you think that would be?
Paul.
Paul, thank you. How did it work out? He gets shipwrecked. Isn't that interesting? Because Israel, if you look on a map, it's crunched up against the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, most of Israel is right along the coast. Yet where are all the cities? If you look on a map, where are all the cities in Israel? Jerusalem, inland. Bethlehem, inland. Jericho, inland. They're all inland. They didn't want anything to do with the ocean. The cities that were formed along the ocean in the Old Testament were all the Philistine cities. They stayed away from them. Just up north, we find two cities often mentioned in the Bible, Tyre and Sidon. They were populated by Phoenicians. They loved the ocean. They traded all over the Mediterranean. They sailed everywhere. The Hebrew people, who were linguistically and culturally somewhat similar to Tyre and Sidon, they wanted nothing. They would go and trade with Tyre and Sidon, but they wouldn't send off trading ships anywhere. They were terrified of the ocean. Absolutely terrified. Why? Because it was a place of the unknown. On this picture of a ship being overwhelmed by ocean. Now, obviously, that's a modern ship. And that's not a lake, but that's how they pictured the ocean. And a lot of parts of the Bible talk about the sea. I read this earlier. Rule the raging sea, when its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. Rahab. What's that word, Rahab? You wonder what that's about? There is a Rahab in the Old Testament. In the book of Jericho, or the book of Joshua. This is not the same person. Rahab, as best we could translate it, was something of a sea monster. What exactly? We don't know. Was it a legendary creature? Was it something that, like a whale or something like that? Whales in our mind today are cuddly little creatures. Everybody likes whales. We saw a couple of whales from a distance on our trip this last a week and a half ago. They were quite neat. We like to see them. But think back. Moby Dick. I mean, that was more history's idea of a whale. Something terrifying. If you want to understand how most of history has viewed whales, go back and watch the old Disney Pinocchio. Because really up until Greenpeace in the 1960s, whales were not considered cuddly. Before that, they were considered quite terrifying. And that might be what it's talking about Rahab. We don't actually know exactly how to translate that word. But what's the point of it? The point was, you went out to sea, you found scary stuff. You found scary stuff. Let's do a little quick walk through some Old Testament verses. Listen to these words out of Ezekiel. And it's talking about particularly Egypt. You consider yourself the lion of the nations, but you are like a dragon in the seas. You burst forth in your rivers, trouble the waters with your feet, and foul their rivers. This was a place of enemies. This was a place where all sorts of things that were evil were found. Job, when he's going through all his tough times, and people are coming and thinking that he must have done lots of wrong, he must have been, he must have offended God, he must have sinned, and he says, am I the sea? Or a sea monster that you set a guard over me? In other words, do you look at me and think that, I can put some context. He has these friends who comes and visits him. And is he saying to these friends, so what are you, some guard to keep me from infecting everybody else? I'm so evil? Am I like the sea? It was a place of evil. Psalm 78. Actually, I take that back. This is Ezekiel 27. Your riches, your wares, your merchandise, your mariners and your pilots, your caulkers, your dealers in merchandise, and all your men of war who are in you, with all your crew that is in your midst, sink into the heart of the seas on the day of your fall. We actually looked at this verse. We did a sermon series on Ezekiel a year ago. This is talking about the city of Tyre, which is a city where they did go out in the water, and he's basically looking at them and saying, hey, you're going to continue to go on the seas, eventually it's going to catch up with you and everything's going to sink, because this is a place of loss. You send out enough ships, eventually they're going to sink. Listen to this from Proverbs, and now I'm taking a little piece, I don't have time to read the whole thing. When he assigned to the sea its limits, so that the waters might transgress his commands, when he marked out the foundations of the earth. The context for this verse is, he's talking about foolishness. And God put boundaries around foolishness, just like he put boundaries around the sea, that land would come up. And that the sea is a symbolic place of foolishness. Hebrew people, it was foolish to go on the water. It was foolish to set out on a ship on the sea. This. God will not turn back his anger. Beneath him bowed the helpers of Rahab. Again, we come to this sea monster idea. This out of Job. It's Job speaking in frustration that this was a place of judgment. This was a place where God would punish people. Isaiah, they growl and seize their prey. They carry it off and none can rescue. They will growl over it on that day like the growling of the sea. And if one looks to the land, behold darkness and distress, and the light is darkened by its clouds. Again, he's speaking of nations that are predatory to Israel, and he says that they're like the sea. And danger and the sea are put together. And it all culminates that basically what all this means is that this is a place of fear. Jonah, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me, all your waves, and all your billows passed over me. And after this, Jonah talks about losing sight of God. We know that the storm comes up, it's inevitable. In life, a diagnosis comes. An accident occurs. Income changes. Marriage falls apart. Child lashes out. And it sometimes can feel like good is barely holding on. Feels like the sea overwhelms. Fears can overwhelm us. can talk a lot about fears. What about self-doubt? Fear because self-doubt? Question that nags in the back of my mind, am I good enough? Am I doing well? Is my life on the right track? Somehow we can never accomplish anything, and that's our negative focus. If we can't find our full confidence in God, we tend to live our lives under others' perceived expectations. In other words, what we think other people expect of us, especially maybe even sort of the very ends of our lives, our parents' expectations. And we fear looking foolish because maybe it's going to reveal something within our hearts that we know is not right, and maybe that I'm not good enough. We might also fear, we can fear that I'm not good enough. We can also fear a loss of security. In our day and age, unlike people of ancient times, we know a fair bit about security. We don't have to worry about marauding tribes running off with our stuff. But there's lots of other ways which we can fear a loss of control over our lives. That perhaps illness will come up, or a lack of financial security, or all sorts of other things. And we all know that there will be times where life doesn't make any sense, and yet, when they come, sometimes we lose track of where God's at. What do I do in those moments? The sea is symbolic of the accumulation of all our fears. And Jesus calms the seas. In Mark, Jesus comes along early in the book of Mark, and he's different. And he starts to bring about his disciples, but he doesn't fulfill society's understanding of who he should be. And so he's rejected. And he starts, in the words immediately before what we looked at in Mark 4, preparing his disciples for the fact that he has not come to fix the world. He has come to prepare followers who are to go out and fix the world. And he begins to teach them that it's not going to be easy, but there will be rewards. And now with this story of him calming the seas, he's showing them that it is possible. What frightens me the most does not even wake Jesus up. He's not fretting about the things that we fret about. Death, he's there. I'm weak, strength comes. I don't feel like I'm good enough, he's sufficient. In fact, the remarkable thing about the kingdom of God is this. It is only for those who are not good enough. He's starting to prep them. Do you know what? You've got these fears. There are bigger things coming that you need to fear. It's August still, so it might be a little early to think about hockey. This is Carey Price of the Montreal Canadiens. This is his helmet from a couple of years ago. Over the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of in the news about the government of Quebec coming up with laws against certain religious displays. And a lot of that has been focused on what that's going to do to Sikhs and Muslims. That helmet, because of the cross on the back, could become illegal in a Canadian province. Is that something to fear? That the fact that we might have things to fear that are coming down the road. I don't think that people of Quebec really realize that they may be making Carey Price's helmet illegal. Now, I have no idea what his spiritual beliefs are. I don't know where he's at. I actually tried to look this week. All I know is for a while he had a cross on the back of his helmet. Do you know what? Jesus is teaching you, you may be rejected. You may be considered opposed to modern society, but carry on. Because I have the power over your fears, and you better start with the fears that you have now, because there might be bigger fears coming. Don't focus on your fears. Focus on the one who's asleep at the back of the boat. God's strength is bigger than our fears. So we took that picture on our holidays. There's a calm sea. Jesus is the fulfillment of all our calamities. The sea may be the place of fear, of death, uncertainty, but it's controlled by the one sleeping on the back of the boat. The one who has a single word that can control the storm. We'll look at just a few more verses from the Old Testament. Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. The very kingdom of God is built on the things that we fear the most. How about that? I like to call it the great reversal. The fact that we have power and weakness. The fact that sinners are made righteous. The fact that those who should be judged are judged rightly. What we fear the most, God builds there. The place where we are the weakest, that's where God can act the most. I read Psalm 89 earlier. I've read it a couple times now. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. The heavens are yours. The earth also is yours. The world and all that you have in it, you have founded them. What's he done with the thing that we fear the most? He's got this sea monster, whale, whatever it is, Rahab. What's he done? He's crushed it. Like it was nothing. Like it was nothing. The place where we find the most fear, God is found here. Psalm 33. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their hosts. He gathers the waters of the sea as a heap. In other words, he stacks them up on each other. He puts the deeps in his storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. Since God does not fear what we fear, the psalmist is making the argument, don't fear those things. Fear God. Fear God. Because he's bigger than all of them. It is much more constructive to fear God than the circumstances of life. One more. Psalm 98. Let the sea roar, and all that fills it, the world and those who dwell in it. God's coming in judgment to make it right, is what's going to go on to say. God's going to make it right, so let it roar. We have illness and roars. Do you know what? God's strong. We have insecurities in our hearts about wondering who we are. Well, God makes us right, so let it roar. The world stands up to us and wants to make us an enemy. Let them roar. God's stronger. So what does Jesus do? He wakes up. He rebukes the wind. He says to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was great calm. Our eyes on our fears, or our eyes on Jesus? Where do our thoughts dwell? Do we let our thoughts go to our fears and maybe I'm not good enough? Maybe there might be insecurities in my life. Do my thoughts dwell there? Or do I fill my life with the thoughts of the one who calms the sea? I may have a lot of self-doubt. I may lack security for life. But Jesus is the one who's powerful. Jesus is the one who's incredible. Look to the one who calms the sea. I invite our worship team to join us as we sing a hymn.